All right, John, welcome. Are you ready for a friendly game of chess?
Yeah, I guess I'm ready to play, but can you go over the rules again?
Sure, it's pretty simple. You've got all these pieces, right? And they can move in different ways. This is the pawn. It can go one or two, or it can only eat diagonally. Blah, 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 blah.
Can you slow down?
Then you've got the rook. The rook can go whoosh.
Okay.
The knight can jump. In L's, the bishop can go diagonally. The queen can do all that. The king really can't do much, so don't touch it. And that's pretty much it.
One question.
Actually, one more important thing. This is how two hit and damage works, okay? So let's say you've got your pawn right here, and I've got my pawn right here, and it's my turn. I could eat your pawn by going like that. And then what I do is I take a 20-sided die, and I roll. If I get anything between a 1 and a 20, I hit your pawn. And then I do damage on it. So if I do a 1, 2, or 3, you take 1 point of damage. If I roll a 4, 5, or 6, you take 1 point of damage. So I'm rolling, I got a 3, you take 1 point of damage, and I eat your pawn. It's now dead.
So 1 point of damage will kill my pawn?
Yes. It'll kill any piece on the board. Every piece does 1 point of damage, and every piece can only have 1 hit point of damage. Got it?
So why are we rolling a d20 if all the numbers hit?
Because that's the game. You have to hit your opponent. When you hit your opponent, you do damage.
That's dumb.
No. It's part of the game. It's part of the game. Just follow the rules, okay?
But why are we rolling damage?
No. You have to roll damage. 1, 2, or 3 on a 6-sided die, 1 point of damage. 4, 5, or 6, 1 point of damage. Got it?
Yeah, it's going to be a good game.
Yeah, it's going to be a really fun game. What do Battleships and Barbarians have in common? Well, the answer may surprise you. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the mathematical abstraction known as hit points, and how Barbarians and Battleships are related because of them. Now, if you're new to tabletop role-playing games, the term hit points and hit dice may seem a bit confusing, but don't worry, I'll get you there. When I first heard about hit points, I had no clue what it meant or how they differed from hit dice. I also didn't understand their importance and how or why I needed to track them as a dungeon master. But have no fear, I'll explain what these cryptic terms mean shortly. If you're new here, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified of more great videos such as this one. Without further ado, welcome to another episode of the Philosophy of Game Mastering. Again, my name is Joe Raposa, and I'm really glad you're here. Now, if you've been playing tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons for as long as I have, you know exactly what hit points are and why they're important. You may even know that dungeon masters keep track of the monster's hit points, and the players usually keep track of their own. Wait, did you say the players usually keep track of their own? What other ways can you do it, Joe? Well, I have some ideas with regards to how I like to track hit points, which I'll share with you later. But before I get to that, let's talk about the history of where hit points come from and how they made it into D&D. Now, you've undoubtedly heard of the game of chess, I assume. Chess is a 2-player game where each player attempts to win by capturing the opponent's king. It's like capture the flag, but with royalty. In chess, each piece has a binary life force. And unlike Schrodinger's cat, a chess piece can't be alive and dead at the same time. Sorry, Erwin. In chess, each piece has a binary endurance. It's either in play or it's captured. There's no in between. However, this simple battle method in chess makes it limiting for other types of wargames. Wargames and role-playing games, for instance, often need a more nuanced system to track the health and damage of individual units or characters, adding layers of realism and enhancing gameplay. In the early wargames, where a military unit was typically made up of more than one soldier, it created more overhead to track outcomes of battles than a game of chess. And the nature of these grouped military units, and the game rules that supported them, needed a non-binary way to help capture a sense of realism. A realism that chess lacked. The binary endurance of a chess piece would not only be too unrealistic in a military wargame, but would prove to be too boring to play as well. What is a wargame? Well, wargames are just military-based strategic board games, attempting to mimic the battles of armies. The earliest wargames were invented in the German states around the turn of the 19th century. They were derivatives of chess, but the pieces represented real military units, like cavalry, infantry, and artillery. In early wargames, such as Helvig and Venturini, Units were like chess pieces in that when attacked, they were simply killed and removed from play, even if the pieces represented groups of soldiers. Then, in 1812, a Prussian nobleman and wargaming enthusiast named George Leopold von Reiswitz wanted to develop a more realistic wargame, one that allowed for more realistic terrain with different elevations, and a more robust combat system. Unlike chess, combat units in Reiswitz's game could suffer partial losses yet still remain on the battlefield. A unit might withstand several rounds worth of enemy attacks before being removed. Reiswitz's game was then the first to incorporate unit hit points. Even though the Reiswitz family first conceived of rules for non-binary wargame units, its complexity made calculations and damage tracking cumbersome. For example, if the military marched in 3 ranks, every point of damage would result in 5 men being lost. 1 point, 5 men. However, if the infantry only marched in 2 ranks, the effective fire was reduced. In that case, it would require 3 points of damage to cause the loss of 10 men, not 2 points. Yes, it's a little confusing and hard to track when you've got a huge army. By rejecting the binary method of damage, Reiswitz inaugurated a tradition of endurance in wargaming, systems wherein a unit can sustain quantitative damage without being destroyed. Hit points in Dungeons & Dragons are fundamentally descended from this idea of endurance. That excerpt was from Playing at the World by John Peterson. In the early 1930s, a gentleman by the name of Fletcher Pratt had simplified the endurance mechanic. Fletcher Pratt was the inventor of a set of rules for naval wargaming, which he created before the Second World War. This game is simply known as the Fletcher Pratt Naval Wargame, and it involved dozens of tiny wooden ships. In Pratt's wargame, each player is the commander of a single ship, effectively making their ship their entire army. Pratt's naval game thus treats a warship as a composite entity, one that slowly relinquishes its capabilities, such as movement, speed, and firepower, as it withstands enemy bombardment. These early decisions of endurance played an important role in the Constitution attribute in D&D, and would influence how damage and hit points worked. The year is 1979, and Dungeons & Dragons is now 5 years old, having captured the imaginations of gamers of all ages and backgrounds. D&D's success owes much to the surge in popularity of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings series, which saw a significant revival in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This resurgence brought fantasy literature into the mainstream, paving the way for D&D to introduce tabletop role-playing to a wider audience eager to explore their own epic adventures in a fantastical world. As the first game of its kind, D&D quickly became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring countless players to embrace the possibilities of storytelling and collaborative gameplay. The British rock band Led Zeppelin, known for their blues-inspired riffs, also drew heavily from Tolkien's mythology, incorporating references into tracks like Ramble On, The Battle of Evermore, and Misty Mountain Hop. In 1979, D&D was a rocket ship of success, and its fans' love of fantasy-based storytelling was its fuel. Ship endurance becomes constitution in Dungeons & Dragons. On page 82 of the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, under the section simply entitled Hit Points, it states the following. Hit points reflect both the actual physical ability of the character to withstand damage, and a commensurate increase in such areas as skill in combat and similar life or death situations. The sixth sense, which warns the individual of some otherwise unforeseen events, sheer luck, and the fantastic provisions of magical protections and/or divine protection. Therefore, Constitution, the attribute that modifies a character's hit points, affects both actual ability to withstand physical punishment, physique, and the immeasurable areas which involve the sixth sense and luck, fitness. It's clear from these words that hit points not only represented a character's physical health, but also their ability to withstand damage based on their luck, their sixth sense, and otherworldly magical and divine protections. And this makes a ton of sense to me. If hit points were just about physical damage, most 15th level characters would have hit points much closer to their first level equivalents. Hit points are really more about experience. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the type of hit die used to generate a monster's hit points is determined by that monster's size. Wait, Joe. You haven't talked about hit die yet. Let's talk about hit die. Okay, you're right. Let's talk about hit die. A hit die is a type of dice, either a 4-sided, 6-sided, 8-sided, 10-sided, 12-sided, or 20-sided die that is used to make up a monster's hit points. So let's say a monster has 5 hit dice and its size small. That uses a d6. The dungeon master, you, would take a d6, roll it 5 times, and add it up. That would be the monster's hit points. The hit points being the number of points of damage the monster could take before it either dies or goes unconscious. Here's a breakdown based on monster size and their die type. Tiny, D4, small, D6, medium, D8, large, D10, huge, D12, gargantuan, D20. In D&D, when a character gains levels, their hit points increase accordingly by their hit die type as well. But it's not based on their size. It's based on their character class. In general, the character's physical size remains the same as they go up in level. Therefore, all increases to a character's hit points are an abstraction that has more to do with their luck, sixth sense, and magical or divine powers. Let's look at an example. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, a fighter's hit point progression is determined by their hit die, which in this case is a d10 for a fighter. Then they also add in their constitution modifier, if any. A breakdown of the average hit point progression for a fighter class from 1st to 15th level looks something like this. Therefore, a fighter with a +2 constitution modifier would have an average of 124 hit points at 15th level. Hit points and the Bloodied condition. What is the Bloodied condition, you might ask? On June 6, 2008, when Dungeons & Dragons was 36 years old, Wizards of the Coast released the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons. D&D 4e introduced a new game condition called Bloodied. The Bloodied condition occurs when a creature or character has lost half or more of their maximum hit points. So, taking the example of a 15th level fighter who has a maximum hit point score of 100, they would be considered bloodied when their hit points fell to 50 or less. The Bloodied condition wasn't officially moved into D&D 5th edition, but it is mentioned once in the 2014 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide. On page 248 of that book, it states, "You can describe a monster taken to half his hit points as bloodied, giving the player a sense of progress in a fight against a tough opponent, and helping them judge when to use their most powerful spells and abilities." Although bloodied is only mentioned once in the 5e DMG, and more as a description than an official condition, it's actually mentioned 56 times in the 4th edition Player's Handbook. Yes, 56 times. Now, there's a reason why I think the Bloodied condition wasn't carried over to 5e from 4e, but it actually could be. Of all the other conditions that actually were carried over to 5th edition, none of them involved hit points. Well, unless you count the unconscious condition, when a character is reduced to 0 hit points. But I'll argue that the unconscious condition isn't really about hit points, because a character can be knocked unconscious in other ways. For example, with the sleep spell, you can still have max hit points and still be unconscious. But having 0 hit points is one of the triggers of the unconscious condition. I do understand that. Regardless of its unofficialness in 5e, I think the Bloodied condition should be used in your 5th edition campaign. Why, you might ask? Well, it's a wonderful trigger for secondary effects and can make combat more exciting, dynamic, and unpredictable. All the things I love in a great D&D battle. In fact, on the website thegamer.com, in an article entitled Dungeons & Dragons Bloodied Condition Explained, Mason Qua, its author, reveals several great ways to use the Bloodied condition. Even though he lists 5 examples in that article, I'll only talk about the first. If you want to see the other 4, I have a link in the description so you can check out his article. In Mason's article, the first suggestion he has for you as a dungeon master is to use magical triggers in your game. There are multiple spells that allow the user to program in specific triggers. As an example, the spells Contingency and Glyph of Warding both activate when a preset condition occurs. The suggestion that Mason has for how to use this in your game is to have a villain, who the party isn't really supposed to kill yet, cast a contingency spell that teleports him away from safety when he's bloodied. a contingency spell cannot be counterspelled. Now, I like where Mason is going with this, but as a dungeon master myself, I'm not sure I'd allow a spellcaster in my campaign, whether they were a PC or an NPC for that matter, to use the contingency spell in a manner that crosses the threshold between in-game and metagame. Now you might be saying to yourself, what are you talking about, Joe? Well, what I mean here is that I wouldn't allow a PC to create a trigger for the contingency spell that the PC wouldn't know about in the actual game. And since the Bloodied condition is something only a player would know about and not their character, I wouldn't allow it as a trigger for the spell. The example given in the player's handbook for the spell contingency references water breathing as an example, with a trigger of something like, if my character becomes submerged in water, trigger my water breathing spell. Now, this makes sense as an in-game trigger for the contingency spell, because a character would know about water and whether or not they fell into water. However, stating a condition such as bloodied, specifically using that term, shouldn't be allowed as a valid in-game spell trigger. You also couldn't say something like, trigger my spell when I reach half my hit points, because a character doesn't know about hit points. But stating something that says, if I ever become unconscious, trigger my spell. Now that would work. As an example, a character could state, trigger my teleport spell if I fall unconscious. This works because the spellcaster knows about being unconscious in the game world, but wouldn't necessarily know about bloodied or even the unconscious condition. However, unconscious is a real term that a character could use. Is this making any sense to you? Let me know in the comments what you think. And as a dungeon master, would you allow the term bloodied to be used by your players to talk about something their character is doing? How I track hit points. As I mentioned earlier, dungeon masters typically track hit points and damage for the monsters, and the players usually keep track of their hit points and damage themselves. However, sometimes as a DM, I like to keep track of everyone's hit points, the monsters and the players. But Joe, why would you do that? Why in the world would you want to do that? Great question. I have a few reasons. Number 1, playability. It allows the PCs to be focused on the battle and helps hide details that their characters wouldn't know about. For example, when you're sick or injured in real life, you know how bad you feel without having to calculate hit points. As the DM, this allows you to focus on using descriptions of the hits a PC sustains and how bad it makes them feel. Whether it causes bleeding, a broken arm, or if a hit is so powerful it knocks the character back 10 feet into a dungeon wall. That can all be done through description. Now, the second reason I like to hide hit points are abstraction. If players don't know their current hit points, they'll think more strategically about the battle. It helps separate the environment from the rules and removes game information that may unduly influence their character's decisions. The third and last is realism. By not having to track real-world mathematical calculations all the time, it allows the players to be more immersed in the game world, making it seem more realistic and intriguing. It also helps focus their imaginations on more important parts of the game. You might be thinking, Joe, are you crazy? As a DM, I'm already dealing with so much overhead as it is during a game session. Why would I want to take on more work and have to track the PC's hit points when they can easily do it themselves? That's a good question, but if you're still not convinced, that's okay. But I do want to let you in on a little secret. It's really not that hard to keep track of all the hit points in a battle, especially if you have the right system in place. This is my secret hit point system. Hiding the PC's current hit points from them is what I call secret hit points, for obvious reasons. And the way I keep track of this is by focusing on ticks and tracks instead of adds and subtracts. That sounds weird, Joe. What are you talking about? Graph paper to the rescue. Other than dice, rulebooks, and a pencil, a DM's best friend is graph paper. Ah yes, trusty old graph paper. Graph paper is great for drawing out dungeon maps, but they're also great for matrices and damage charts. What's a damage chart, you might ask? Well, it's the next best thing to sliced pie. Through the magic of graph paper, I've created a simple yet powerful system to keep track of monster hit points as well as the players, if you so desire. In an upcoming video, I'll be showing you how I track damage for monsters as well as PCs, and I'll even give you my free template so you can do it yourself. In my next video, I'll show you how I use my damage tracker to keep track of monster hit points as well as player characters' hit points. I also invented a pretty unique way, I think, of keeping track of healing on that damage chart. And I'll explain what all this means in my next video. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your support. If you haven't subscribed, please do, and hit the bell icon to be notified of more videos like this one. I also would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment for any topics you'd like me to work on. Now, I've got a ton of ideas of my own, but I want to make sure that I'm doing things for you and what you like to see. So please drop a comment, let me know what type of video you'd like to see, whether you want to see more comedy, more seriousness. I can mix it up. All right. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you next time. This has been the Philosophy of Game Mastering, and I appreciate you being here. Thanks. Before I go, I forgot to tell you one thing. By request, I started a Patreon page because in one of my older videos, I had mentioned that I lost my job last October in 2023, and I've been doing this mostly part-time since then. However, I still don't have a job, even though I've been looking. So I set up a Patreon in case you want to help support me, make these videos, and bring great content to you about Dungeons and Dragons and other games. There's a link in the description. Um, please don't feel obligated to support me just because I lost my job. I really like making these videos, and if I can do this a little bit more often and put out more videos more of the time, that's all the thanks I need from you guys. Just comment and subscribe. All right, thanks. Talk to you later.